All right, guys, we're back. Welcome to the second half of our section on human rights law, and we're going to focus on international human rights law and how different countries have kind of gotten together to look at human rights and at least attempt to protect human rights, um, and how kind of what the future might look like. Okay, so remember, 2 sections ago, I ended with a thing about how there was, first came natural law, and then second came the recording of positive rights, and then step 3 was the combination of those two. We have this concept of natural law, that there is this human rights idea and this human rights uh, 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 belief, and this we can't, there's a law above even what countries have written down as law, and that is really essentially human rights. Then there's the positive rights that people have actually written down, i.e., freedom of religion, freedom of choice, freedom of all these things, of which the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, is a great example. But it's really the synthesis of those two things that comes about in international law, right? One of the first attempts to do a really big international legal body was the League of Nations. Okay, after World War One, the Allies were victorious, right? America, Britain, France, they were the winning side. Austria, Germany, those were the losing side. And Woodrow Wilson, who's the president of the United States at the time, comes up with this idea to have an international group of countries that could meet together and talk about these things and try to prevent the next world war. Because World War I was this horrible, horrible, horrible war where millions and millions of people were killed, and the victors, the United States and Britain and France and those other countries, really wanted to try to make sure that this didn't happen again. So it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, and a lot of other countries jumped right on it. A lot of other countries were like, yeah, it's a great idea. We're going to form this League of Nations. And so they started working and planning and doing, and there was this whole League of Nations thing. And then Woodrow Wilson comes back, and he kind of says to the United States, hey, I had this idea, and now they're going with it, and they're creating this League of Nations. Can we, join this thing? And America was really divided. And there's actually 2 political cartoons there. And one of them, that one, is kind of showing that with the League of Nations, these other groups are going to be able to kind of tie the United States' hands. And it's going to prevent the United States from kind of doing what it wants. And that's the bad thing. And on the other side is essentially showing, Woodrow Wilson offering this giant olive branch of peace to the world. And they really want Wilson's idea to come to fruition. But of course, the first group won. The United States did not join the League of Nations. It eventually ended up failing, and World War II happened. Which, honestly, from a historical point of view, World War II was just kind of a continuation of World War I. There was a famous general, and I forget his name, but he looked at the armistice after World War I, and he said, that's not a peace treaty, that's a 20-year ceasefire. And sure enough, almost exactly 20 years later, World War II started. And of course, once again, it was this horrible, horrible war, millions and millions and millions of people dying, really took over the world, and it was really a horrible, horrible time. So afterwards, everybody kind of got together and said, hey, that League of Nations thing, that was a good idea. Let's execute it better this time. Let's try it again, but let's do it better. So they made the United Nations, and that has been much more of a success than the League of Nations ever was. So the United Nations is this giant international body of, I can't even remember how many countries now. It's almost all the countries in the world are members of the United Nations. But it's kind of divided into 6 groups. Okay, there's the General Assembly, which is where everybody's invited. Everybody gets a seat. They can bring up issues and talk about issues. The Security Council is maybe the most powerful of any of these groups. The Security Council is the one kind of in charge of the military arm of the UN, right? Which the UN doesn't have its own military arm. It just kind of uses its constituent countries' troops to accomplish UN goals, right? So like the war in Korea in the early 50s, that was a UN action, but the vast majority of the troops were American troops. But the Security Council is essentially the 5 winning members of World War II, which were the United States, Britain, France, China, and the USSR. And then there's rotating seats other than that, right? So all the other seats on the Security Council rotate through all the other countries on like a yearly or bi-yearly basis. The Economic and Social Council, obviously, they're the ones concerned with economic issues very specifically. The Trusteeship Council was originally built to deal with these trustees, these new areas they opened and new things they did right after World War II. But because those no longer exist, this council no longer exists. So it was originally 6, now it's down to 5. The International Court of Justice tries kind of international war crimes. And then there's the Secretariat, which is kind of the administrative section of the UN, right? So those are the now 5 big groups that do all this work for the United Nations, trying to make the world a better place, trying to improve the poor countries, trying to help countries deal with problems, help people in countries have their human rights respected, things like that. Underneath the United Nations, there are a whole bunch of kind of sub-organizations that work for the UN and report to one or more of the 5 groups above. You've probably heard of a lot of these. There's UNICEF, which is about like children and families, right? UNICEF is very concerned with children and making sure they have enough food to eat and make sure they get schools and things like that. There's the WHO, the World Health Organization. They do essentially medical research and medical treatments around the world, and they're kind of the medical branch of the UN and how they can help medical issues. The IMF is the International Monetary Fund. They are essentially like a worldwide bank. Okay, they're able to lend money to countries that need it. There's a lot of controversy with the IMF because a lot of people see their mission as kind of predatory because they essentially, the knock on them is that they loan money to these very poor countries and then charge them interest on it, so those poor countries are never out from under the debt. So essentially the accusation against the IMF is that these poor countries get locked into a pattern of debt, and that's bad. UNESCO is about kind of world heritage, like they do a lot of preserving history, preserving old buildings, history, artifacts, things like that. The WTO is the World Trade Organization. But this is not a complete list. There are a whole bunch of these sub-organizations underneath the UN that do a lot of this day-to-day work around the world that the UN wants to have done. One of the most important things the UN has ever done is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Okay? Think about what's happening in the world in 1948. We just finished World War II 3 years earlier. United Nations is practically brand new. But we had a very, very public trials for the defeated Axis powers and charging them with these human rights violations. And this brought up the question, well, the things they did in Germany and Japan that we're trying these people for weren't illegal under German or Japanese law, but we're still trying them and convicting them for these human rights violations. But what exactly are those? Like, most of the people kind of agreed that, like, what the Nazis did to the Jews and to homosexuals and to the gypsies and all those other groups was horrible and wrong, and they absolutely should be punished for this. But where do we draw that line? What are the human rights abuses that we know should be punished, i.e. the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese and the things they did to the Chinese and the Koreans. We know those are horrible. We know people should be tried for that. But at what point does it reach that, right? So the UN sat down and they wrote up this giant, this really long Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this was very important, okay? And it's a lot of the things we've talked about so far. It's, everybody has the right to freedom of expression. Everybody has the right to life. Everybody has the right to be protected from cruel and unusual punishment, right? There was a lot of overlap with the American Bill of Rights here. But there were a lot of things that were in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that aren't they aren't law in the United States, right? And in fact, there was a court case in 2004 where Sosa v. Alvarez Machain, honestly, I don't know how to pronounce that. But that court case right there that you can see that's written on the slide, the Supreme Court had to rule that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not binding law. And it's not. It is a declaration, not an international law or an international treaty, right? The UN intended it to be a starting place. The UN intended it to be a place where anybody who's writing a law or a constitution or whatever, a place they can go to begin to think, okay, what human rights are important? What should I include in this law? What should I include in this constitution? Now, what our law do have the force of international law or national law are the things listed below. In 1948, in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was also a convention on genocide, right? So genocide is illegal with the force of international law, and that can be punished. If a country violates that, they can be punished. Same thing with slavery, came about in 1956. How we treat refugees from 1951. And then the famous one is the 1948, the Geneva Conventions, right? The Geneva Conventions had existed prior to 1948, but 1948 was kind of the last one where they took all the work that had been done in those previous ones, put them all together, added a bunch of stuff about how you treat civilians in wartime, and those are the ones that are kind of enforceable international law today. So, Europe got together in 1950 and essentially said, look, we're going to take that Universal Declaration of Human Rights and we're going to say, essentially, that list of rights, with some differences, are enforceable international law in Europe. Okay, if you violate one of these laws, you can go to this European Convention, this pan-European court, and be held liable for violating those human rights. And this has had a few different cases that have gone through this European Court of Human Rights that were kind of interesting and important, right? So in 1977, some prisoners in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, went to this European court and alleged that their treatment in these UK prisons constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Because remember, at this point in time, the 1970s, there was a really, really big kind of not overt declared war, but like a guerrilla war happening in Ireland between the Protestants and the Catholics. Those who wanted to be a separate Irish country and those who wanted to be part of the UK. And the UK was kind of being, how should I put this, a little heavy-handed with the Irish people that they caught committing these kind of terrorist acts, as they saw it. And so they would capture these terrorists and treat them rather poorly. And so these prisoners went to the European court and successfully won a court case against the UK for cruel and unusual punishment. In 2009, very similar case, the UK was treating terrorism suspects from the International War on Terror that started after 9/11. The UK was one of our biggest allies in that war, and they were holding terrorism suspects in a way that violated this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, that are, again, very similar. So once again, the United Kingdom lost a court case in this European court. They were found to have violated the human rights of these terrorist suspects. Just so we don't have to pick on the UK the entire time, there was another one, MSS versus Belgium and Greece, which is from 2011. And there are international laws that say, essentially, if people show up to your country and request asylum, you have to treat them, you have to do this, 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 and this. You can't just turn them away. You can't just throw them in prison. You can't, do all these really horrible things to people who are legally coming to your country and saying, hey, I need asylum. There are standards of how you have to treat these people according to international law. What happened here in this case is that essentially this person left their home country. I can't remember where it was, but they were fleeing. They arrived in Greece, was their first stop in Europe. Then they went to Belgium and requested asylum in Belgium. The Belgians said, no, you can't request asylum here because you have to ask for asylum in the first place you came, which is Greece. And then Greece said, no, you can't apply for asylum here because you're supposed to apply for it in Belgium. And they kept kind of passing this guy back and forth and would not hear his asylum claim. So he went to this International Human Rights Court and they said, look, you guys have to stop passing him off to the other. Hear his asylum claim. You have to rule on this. You can't just try to pass him off to the other country. So, through the UN, we obviously also have this big international criminal court, right? It started really with the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, which we have pictures of here, right? There's the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials over there, and we tried, convicted, and in many cases executed a lot of the former Nazis and high-level imperial Japanese who had done these really horrible things and violated so many people's human rights. But the International Criminal Court was just kind of an ad hoc court, an ad hoc system for a long time after that. It would just kind of be created for an issue like Rwanda and Yugoslavia in the 90s. And then after it was done for that, it would close down again. So it didn't become a permanent fixture until 1998. And since 1998, we've had this permanent International Criminal Court. And the crimes they're allowed to, or the crimes they are able to prosecute are genocide, other war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, which essentially means using your military in a cruel, aggressive way, and then contempt of court. Since 1998, they haven't gotten that much work, okay? They only had 11 investigations, resulting in 44 indictments, which is one day in a big American city, you get more than 44 indictments. But these indictments are for these really major crimes. And since 1998, they've only handed down 6 guilty verdicts with, associated prison time. 4 of the 6 were for contempt of court. They served less than a year and they're out. 2 more are still in prison and will be for a while based on convictions they got in this International Criminal Court. This picture down here is a guy who is essentially, he was a child soldier in what's called the Lord's Resistance Army, which, y'all remember that whole Coney thing from a few years ago? Coney was the leader of this Lord's Resistance Army in Africa and was doing all kinds of really horrible stuff to the people around him, all kinds of human rights abuses. This guy, in the early days, was one of the kids that got kind of abducted and was forced to do all this fighting. But he rose through the ranks and eventually became one of the commanders of one of the subgroups of this Lord's Resistance Army, and commanded his soldiers to do just really, really horrible stuff. And he's actually on trial right now. His trial is currently going through, and they're trying to determine essentially whether he should be held liable for these horrible crimes, or if the fact that he was himself a child soldier who was abducted and had to go through these really horrible psychological torture, essentially, whether that kind of mitigates the crimes he committed later in life. So that's kind of a current ongoing thing with the International Criminal Court. But what's really interesting is how the modern day, right, the 21st century, even into the last part of the 20th century, has moved away from kind of politics and the state and even international law being the controller of human rights, or the people working for human rights and the people focusing on human rights, and more towards these non-governmental groups. Some of them are official groups with like leaders and employees and stuff, and some of them are just social movements, groups that kind of pop up and do their thing and bring attention to their issue and try to solve their issue, and then break up, right? It's not like a permanent organization. It's just a transitive movement, right? So there's NGOs, which are called non-government organizations, right? And there's a bunch of these. The two I have on this slide are Greenpeace and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, both of which have been around for a long, long, long time, probably before most of you guys were even born. They're not governments, but they are official organizations with, there's somebody that's the CEO and, people that work for them and do all this stuff. But they've taken on a lot of these human rights issues. For instance, Greenpeace does a lot of environmental work. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent are obviously like medical and disaster relief, but they're not governments in themselves, right? And then on the other end, there's the social movements, which are not any official group. They're just a movement that's so big, people can kind of go with it if they want to. Anybody can really call themselves a member, but there's no real employees, right? In the United States, we had Occupy Wall Street, which was very concerned with, the greed of Wall Street and how the income inequality is getting worse and worse and worse and worse. A similar group in Europe called the Yellow Vest movement. Every car in France, at least, is legally required to have one of these yellow vests in it. So if you break down, you can put the vest on and you won't get hit by another car. But so they started using these vests that everybody had, or at least everybody who owned a car already had, as a symbol to symbolize their movement, to symbolize their movement, which is essentially about the tax burden and the problems of society falling on the shoulders of the working class rather than the rich, right? So if you look at it as a percentage of income, it's the poor and the middle class who are paying most of the taxes, the fuel taxes and sales taxes and all those things. Poor and middle class people pay way more on that as a percentage of their income than the rich ever do, and they're kind of trying to point out that that's unfair and we need to change that, and it's one of those big things. Another big one in the United States is Black Lives Matter, right? That's a group that came together and said, hey, there's all these African Americans being treated as if their lives don't matter. They're being shot by the police, or they're being mistreated, or they're being thrown in prisons at way higher rates than other groups. We need to focus on this group because they're being focused on for bad things already. Like, we need to, hey, can we help these people that are getting shot and imprisoned and all these horrible things that are happening to them? So that's another one of those social movements that's taking on human rights violations. very important ones. Now, one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name in human rights, is Amnesty International. They've been around, again, probably longer than most of you guys have been alive. They were formed with the very specific goal of trying to make sure that countries respect just the bare, like, they're not asking a lot. They're just, they just want like the bare minimum of respecting human rights in around the world in ways that are very commonly have human rights violated, right? So they have 4 real points. First is they want an immediate release to all prisoners of conscience, i.e. people who said the wrong thing, right? People who said, you know, I don't like the communist regime in China. I think we need to vote on this and that. And people like that have been arrested and imprisoned. And so Amnesty International wants unconditional, immediate release of all those people who are prisoners of conscience, i.e. they said the wrong thing politically or religiously or whatever. Political prisoners, essentially the difference here is between prisoners of conscience and political prisoners. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but if you've ever committed violence or advocated violence on behalf of your goals, according to Amnesty International, you're not a prisoner of conscience anymore, right? So if you've used violence or advocated violence, you're no longer a prisoner of conscience and deserving of the immediate release, right? But you're still deserving at least a fair and prompt trial, right? They want to make sure that every political prisoner, even if they've used violence or advocated violence, bare minimum, at least you need to give them a fair and prompt trial, right? Now, step 3, number 3, they are advocates of an immediate and unconditional end to torture, the death penalty, and any other cruel and degrading treatment. And we're going to have an entire section just on torture, and an entire section just on the death penalty. So we're going to talk a lot more about this. But Amnesty International, absolutely against those things. And then finally, the abolition of extrajudicial executions and disappearances, right, which are much more common things in the modern age because governments now feel the need to hide stuff. You know, 500 years ago, governments didn't need to hide anything. There was no threat to the government system. Whereas now, with, you know, hopefully democracy, but even if you don't have democracy, there's still the internet and videotaping and all those things. Governments are more afraid of their people. So instead of capturing and killing somebody openly, they do it secretly. And again, we're going to have an entire section on this later on. But Amnesty International is huge. They're in 150 different countries, and every time there's a human rights abuse or a case that they want to get involved in, essentially they send a group from a different country. So you're never allowed to do investigations in your own country. They'll send a group from a different country to go in, figure out what's going on, write up an entire report, and then get that report out as much as possible to media outlets around the world, all these things. And you might think that, oh, well, they're writing up a report. That's really not that big a deal. But it has helped a lot of people. There was a prisoner of conscience, I can't even remember where he was, I think somewhere in South America. And essentially Amnesty International took up his case and got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to send letters to the prison saying, like, you need to release this guy. Why are you holding this guy? Release him now. He's a prisoner of conscience. He didn't actually do anything wrong. And immediately his treatment got better, and then within like a couple of months, he actually got released, thanks to the pressure brought about by Amnesty International. So they have actually just raising awareness of these issues and these cases and writing these reports and publishing these things has gotten a lot of people gotten their human rights respected, which is great. The World Service Authority, their big thing is essentially they see world borders and restrictions on international travel as a violation of human rights. They believe that everybody has the right to, essentially, if you're a refugee, if you need a state, you have the right to go into a state and at least apply to be a citizen of that country, but countries don't have the right to keep you out, right? So one of the things they do is they create these world passports, which you can see an example of up there. And they'll give those to refugees and displaced persons and stateless persons. And every time a country lets somebody in using one of these world passports, they kind of use that as a precedent and try to, say, well, this country let this person in, so these world passports are good. They're being respected. They're being treated as if they're real passports. And most countries in the world at some time or another have let in holders of these world passports. It's, people that they kind of really want to let in, like please, we come to our country, you're a refugee, we're, we want to do the right thing and help you. They'll kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yeah, this world passport, sure, we'll accept that because, we want to help you anyway. And then, so this World Service Authority wants to make this kind of more common thing, make these world passports more acceptable. And there's another picture there of Edward Snowden, who got one of these world passports from the World Service Authority because, he's currently wanted in the United States for all kinds of espionage charges and such. And he first fled to, I can't remember where he first fled to. But anyway, then he fled to Russia, and I believe currently living in Russia as a fugitive from justice in the United States. And they gave him one of these world passports so he can, because obviously his American passport isn't going to be good anymore because he's a fugitive. Human Rights Watch, they're another big group. They've gotten a lot bigger just in the last probably 20 years. They're similar in their mission and goals and processes to Amnesty International, but they do a little bit more of a kind of in-depth background report on the situation of what they're talking about, right? And they'll talk about kind of the political and historical factors that are underlying these human rights abuses that they investigate. And they actually got to share with a few other groups. They shared a Nobel Peace Prize for their work against landmines. They were trying to get and succeeded mostly in getting this anti-landmine international treaty passed. So any country that signs the treaty now is not allowed to use landmines, which are very indiscriminate and kill civilians long after the war is over. So Human Rights Watch is another really, really great movement. But this ends the section, but I want to encourage you to do more investigation into these groups, right? So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, whatever other groups are working on things you care about, follow them on Facebook, find them on Twitter, find them on Instagram, find them on whatever social media, follow them, see how you can get involved, how you can help them and donate money and donate time, donate energy. The one that's really big for me, the one that I've put a lot of effort into is the Innocence Project. Being a criminal justice person, obviously I'm very focused on the criminal justice system, and the Innocence Project is a really great organization that does essentially it works to make sure that people who are in prison unjustly in the United States they work to find the evidence to free them. A lot of times it's DNA evidence, right? So if you got thrown in prison for rape or something back before they routinely did DNA analysis, they work to try to get these old DNA kits tested. The evidence still exists in a lot of these cases, so if the evidence still exists, they'll get the DNA tested and see if that can either provide evidence that the person is guilty or not guilty. And if they're not guilty, well, they've been in prison for who knows how long, you need to let them out. So that's a really, really big, important group for me. But figure out what groups are important to you, whether it's Amnesty International, the Innocence Project, Black Lives Matter, whatever group or movement kind of speaks to you and is working towards a goal that you think is important, find them on social media. Go to their website. Find out more information on those groups. That's a really important thing, I think, as adults in the 21st century. But anyway, thank you very much. I'll see you for the next section.